Hello, everyone, and good evening. For those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Hilary Hahn, and I'm the Director of Development for the Utah Museum of Fine Arts. As we begin tonight, I would like to reiterate that the University of Utah and the UMFA acknowledges that we are on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Ute, Goshute, Paiute, and Northwestern Shoshone peoples. It is our responsibility to acknowledge the significance of place, continued existence, and the contributions of Indigenous people who have lived on and cared for this land for thousands of years. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's and UMFA's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this exclusive preview of Spacemaker, the University of Utah faculty exhibition. Every 3 years, the UMFA proudly hosts this exhibition. It is a celebration of the University of Utah's artistic faculty, and this year features work by 33 artists who serve within the Department of Art History, a very diverse group of thinkers and creators who are deeply committed to their work as both artists and educators. We have some very special partners who have helped make this exhibition possible: the University of Utah College of Fine Arts and the Department of Art and Art History. Thank you. And of course, our very own UMFA art lovers, all of you, as the inaugural installation sponsors for this show. This was a milestone achievement, and your support has resonated with our faculty, artists, and staff and demonstrated that their work and skill is valued and appreciated. This is an incredibly meaningful sponsorship, so thank you, art lovers. And thank you for joining us tonight. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters for the evening: Nancy Rivera, our guest curator, and Jaclyn Wright and Josh Graham, two University of Utah art faculty members. Nancy Rivera is the Visual Arts Coordinator for the Utah Division of Arts Museums, and we are so grateful for her expertise and commitment on this wonderful exhibition. Welcome, Nancy, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for that lovely introduction. And good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to thank the Utah Museum of Fine Arts for inviting me to curate this very special exhibition featuring the work of University of Utah faculty. And this exhibition holds a lot of meaning for me, and I'm really excited to be sharing some of my experiences curating the exhibition tonight. And I just want to take a moment to share a short personal anecdote. About 10 years ago, I worked as an intern at the museum, and that was my very first experience working at an art institution and learning about the behind the scenes work. And then a few years later, as a student, an MFA student at the University of Utah, the museum graciously offered many learning opportunities through meetings and art critiques with artists and staff that made an impact in the growth and development of my practice as an artist. And fast forwarding to today, to be here as a curator of this exhibition that features the work of so many talented artists, many of whom I have been lucky to call my mentors, is such a thrilling experience. And so I'm just really grateful to the Utah Museum of Fine Arts for nurturing my career from its very beginnings, and thank you so much. And with that, I want to, of course, we're here to have a great conversation with two of the artists in the exhibition. But before we do that, I want to give an introduction and overview about the theme of the exhibition. I will be sharing some slides so that you can get a preview of the work that you will be seeing in a couple of weeks. Okay. So I want to start by talking about the title of the exhibition, which refers to a common theme that emerged through looking at the work selected for this exhibition, which was the artist's exploration of place and space. The work takes various approaches to these themes, Some investigate domesticity or are set in intimate spaces such as homes and their surroundings. We see this in the work of Brian Snapp, whose series of ceramic houses burst from the inside out and speak about the loss of home, which strips people's sense of identity and place. In memory of Anthony Adams, Haynes Goodsell asks us to reflect on a tragic event through a found object that he preserved from a memorial found outside of his apartment building. And Kylie Millward, who looks at domesticity through a female perspective, offering us a narrative about a homemaker who neglects her household chores, perhaps as a way to rebel against societal pressures. But there's also special concern with the current worsening ecological crisis, as we witness its effects through the regularly occurring natural disasters that threaten treasured landscapes and the species found within them. Carol Sogard and Paul Stout directly address the rapidly growing number of endangered species through their work. Sogard's wallpaper patterns mesmerize us with their elaborate designs, but their titles are a reminder of each subject's decline. Stout, whose installation work you will be able to view in person at the exhibition, draws attention to critically endangered species through a bold split flap display that hypnotizes as we watch the constant motion of the flaps. But there's also hope through the work addressing nature. In One the Wishes Reflecting Hope, which is an artificial tree with leaves that have a watery reflective quality that alludes to photosynthesis. The piece's delicate reflections emit joy, light, and create space for hopeful perspective. We also find many imaginative approaches to the exhibition theme, like the work of Ed Bayman, whose Seeking to Blind series was born during a time in lockdown and quarantine. Bateman employed a 3D printer in an attempt to recreate the mountains and spaces that were no longer accessible to us, but which he made accessible through the majestic imaginary landscapes that he created on his kitchen table. And an imaginary world is also found in the work of Naomi Marine, whose mixed media collage concocts a world where snake-like woodland creatures hide handwritten messages throughout the piece. Her visual metaphors allow the viewer an open interpretation of the work. Artist Aldenier creates visual illusions that confuse space and subject. From afar, you may be looking at a mountain range, but up close, it could be skin viewed through a microscope, prompting the viewer to look closer, question, and absorb this intricate landscape. The landscape, both literal and metaphorical, plays an important role in Beth Krinsky's performance piece. In this performance, the artist walks on a pilgrimage toward herself, nature, and the unknown. In her words, she says, "The walk creates and holds space for my fear, courage, isolation, refuge, gratitude, and mortality." And continuing this exploration of our relationship to the land through personal narratives, artists Jaclyn Wright and Joshua Graham's work considers the connection between the body, land, and abstraction. So it is here where I would like to introduce our two guests for tonight, Jaclyn Wright and Joshua Graham. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourselves. Hello, welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
Excited to have you for this conversation. And I think a really great place to start, right now I just gave a very broad picture of what your artwork is about, but I would like each of you to go into a little bit more depth about the themes and subjects that you explore through your overall practice. And while you think about this for a minute, I'm going to go ahead and share some slides of your work as well. And once I get this ready, why don't we start with Jaclyn?
Sure. So the work that's in the exhibition is from particularly this image and another still image are from a series called Marked. And then the video or performance, dual channel performance piece is from a new body of work that I've recently started. And I sort of see the end of Mark transitioning into this new series. And so both series sort of address the relationship between bodies and the landscape. But more specifically, Marked, which is what this image is from, deals with the idea of how bodies are marked, specifically how they're marked from birth and how those marks and constructs can inform how we exist in the world, how we're treated, how we experience things. And so in the work, I sort of use my own birthmark, which is the shape that you're seeing in the middle of this piece, as a way of sort of defining, sort of relating it to a sort of map, or how a political boundary might exist on a map, which expresses the desire to include and exclude, to mark belonging through exclusion and differentiation. And so sort of using it as a form of demarcation, which is meant to represent what is through what isn't, and thinking about this relationship between the land and the body. And as I started this work prior to living in Utah, and it dramatically changed once I moved here. And I sort of witnessed and experienced the West Desert specifically. And so the performance pieces, which are from the newer work and a project that I've just recently started, deals a little bit more with concerns around how, or not concerns, but how sort of rugged individualism and the mythology around the American West are sort of visually manifested. And so thinking about ideas about how current uses of the landscape is intertwined with the history of those who inhabited it and those who have colonized and continue to exploit it. And I look at the desert as one of the sort of last examples of the frontier, where one can act out any of their desires in the name of freedom. And of course, this is problematic in terms of how we think about land use, access, and the relationship to capitalism, manifest destiny, and of course, power. And that's sort of what this performance piece begins to introduce. And then, as I mentioned, this is a sort of impetus for a new body of work that I'm continuing to work on.
Thank you. And Josh, can you talk a little bit about your work as well?
I'd love to. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for the opportunity to be here in this conversation. I feel so honored. So this piece and the other piece that are in the show are part of a larger body of work that I'm titling Desert Rorschach Tests. And oddly enough, I'd like Jaclyn provided a perfect segue into my work by talking about this like desert as the last frontier, and the way we kind of think about the land in that context. And I was thinking about a lot of these ideas when I was creating this work, kind of almost as visual metaphors for this idea of how we impose almost this like self-validation or self-validating reductionism onto the land, and what that allows us to do or not do. The pieces themselves have specific titles that route the artwork to locations in the desert Southwest. However, taken as a whole, the series is meant to be somewhat open-ended, I think. I'm really interested in providing space for the viewer to complete the work, but also keeping it grounded enough so that there is like a contextual relevance there. As an artist, a lot of my research is in that particular region of the state. And so as I continue to like work within this medium and explore some of these ideas, I'm watching the kind of the look and feel of the pieces kind of change over time, but still retain some type of cohesiveness, not unlike the traditional Rorschach test.
Thank you both. That's really interesting. And actually, you touch a little bit on this, but one of my questions is about, you have these bodies of work that very much speak about that relationship to the land. And that made me think about, Jaclyn, you're a somewhat recent transplant to Utah. And I wonder, for both of you, can you speak about how living in the West plays a role in the work that you've created most recently?
Yeah, I mean, the West, as you might imagine, is just totally wildly different from the Midwest, right? And I think one thing that has really sort of been, has really impacted how I sort of see the West is how visible climate change has become for me. I think in the Midwest, we talk about it sort of extreme examples of weather, but here, especially in the West Desert, which is where a lot of my work or all of this work sort of exists, the desert is already this really extreme place, which in a lot of ways makes it really magical. But I think, the drying up of the Salt Lake, the dust storms, the ways that I can sort of like visibly see those things frequently, I find to be especially terrifying and really present. And so I think, in my work, because that feels so, it's sort of like an emotional experience to have, there's like billions of years of evolutionary intelligence that is just like up in flames. And that's like absolutely devastating to me. And so I think the desert exemplifies like the ways in which the climate crisis exists. And I think the desert also for me exemplifies like the ways in which the land continues to be exploited in these really deeply concerning ways that continue to perpetuate climate change and how that affects humans and bodies. So, I don't know that I would make any of this work, at least in the way that I am making it, if I hadn't moved here. So I try to be really present and acknowledging that, I am very new and I'm very much a transplant, but it still sort of has this sort of magical intensity about it that I'm very much drawn to.
What about you, Josh?
I grew up in New York City, but I've called Utah home for the last 20 plus years and spent a fairly considerable amount of time in the desert southwest of our state exploring. And the way I interact with that land has changed remarkably over time. I think, obviously, like many of us when we're younger and not fully aware of some of the ecological implications of some of these areas, that maybe we don't think about that as much. But as I've gotten older and it's become more ingrained and embedded into my art practice, a lot of these ecological concerns have come to the forefront. But I think I take like a maybe slightly different approach where I think I have a very social practice that involves a lot of collaboration. And I kind of try to get to some of these ecological concerns through psychology and self-analysis. And so, I was thinking about the traditional Rorschach test and how it's like a projective test. We have these kind of abstract forms that we're given and allowed to kind of project ideas onto these like, nebulous forms. And I think that's very akin to sometimes what we do here in the West, especially in neglected areas like the West Desert or like, the desert Southwest, where the seemingly vacant nature of the landscape almost allows it to be exploited from like a psychological standpoint. And then, taking that conversation further, that actually, develops into physical changes and how we kind of project our human ideas onto our more than human environments, I think is, a really interesting place to start exploring, especially when it comes to kind of the role of art to help us become aware of some of those things. And then I hope that, that might lead eventually to some sort of like change in our understanding of how we interact with our environment that hopefully would lead to some increase in empathy and change of action.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on the artwork's intent, and I think about that a lot, about, being from Utah and sometimes feeling these, trying to be protective over the land, but also wanting to bring awareness to the importance of preserving these spaces that in many cases are public lands. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that intent behind the work, because it's so layered. There's so many layered meanings behind what you're trying to convey through these pieces, and it's all very heavy subjects. So when somebody approaches this work and, we're talking about climate change and protecting the land and all of these different subjects, like what is, what you really want to convey through the different types of work that we see here, and how are they all connected in that way, if that makes sense?
Josh, do you want to go first?
Sure, Jaclyn. So I don't know. I think about this question a lot, Nancy. I think about it through political lens, through social lenses, because we often talk about how do we build bridges between individuals or communities when our viewpoints on things seem to be so distant. And I guess I'm kind of coming at your question from a roundabout way, Nancy, but I'm thinking about my work as almost a way to spark some type of inner self-analysis, almost as a way to start that conversation internally about and you mentioned this in the statement for the show, Nancy, about space, whether it's a physical space or an emotional space. And I think creating artwork and these works in particular that make up this series, almost as a way to maybe turn that mirror back on the viewer and hopefully promote questions in the viewer that will spark some sort of self-analysis that could in turn maybe lead to maybe a more critical viewpoint on many other things that we hadn't seen. And I think in my own life, I feel like that's one thing I hold really dear when it comes to art in particular. Going to an art gallery or a museum, or seeing a studio, or seeing one of my friends at work working on a project. I'm so motivated and so inspired watching that process, and then the questions that arise from the work, I think, is the real power there. Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that.
I'm trying to remember the exact wording of your question, but I think I can sort of go off of what Josh was saying. So, I mean, I think in terms of the context of how my work is made and what sort of I want the audience to get out of it, I think is it's quite complicated, and I think that's because the work has a lot of layers that I don't think everyone will sort of pull from, although that for me that's a huge part of making the work. So specifically thinking about the connection between how people are sort of shooting guns on Stansbury Island or at Lone Rock, which are two sites that I frequent a lot, versus the Dugway Proving Ground and the Utah Test and Training Sites, and the fact that a prison is being built on the edge, which is absolutely uprooting, habitats, and the Salt Lake is shrinking. So and the fact that some of these areas are indigenous lands. So really thinking about the fact all of these things are interconnected for me. One doesn't exist without the other. I think to not talk about all of the different facets of the desert is a form of erasure. And so I don't know that everyone's going to pull all of those things, which is why I use a sort of symbol the objects that I collect at these sites as sort of a metaphor. And I'm sure that somebody could look at my work and think that it's just about gun use or just about trash that's left on these sites. And it's most definitely not. Those are just sort of a clear visual example of what's happening and how those things can relate to land use access because ultimately, I'm sure, I don't know if either of you have been out there, but like it's absolutely frightening. The first time I experienced people shooting guns in the desert was a BLM person who worked for the BLM coming, the Bureau of Land Management, sorry, who came over and had to ask a person to like stop shooting an assault rifle across the road. So it's not like, you know, I think that like these types of complexities that exist, like it's a visual manifestation of the complications. And so I think about that a lot. And then I also think a way that I'm addressing, because I'm being obviously very critical of what's happening, is attempting to use some amount of like absurdity through like the clay pigeon bikini and like, you know, wearing, for lack of a better word, like booty shorts while I'm like walking around the desert, like cleaning up other people's trash. Like it's absolutely ridiculous. And so I'm sort of trying to use a little bit of like subtle humor and absurdity to reference like the ridiculousness of a lot of these things, but also remaining sort of critical of them, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, what you were saying makes me think about your work as an intervention, but also in some way documenting humans' intervention in these spaces. And this leads me to a different question about both of your processes, which is through your work, Jaclyn, specifically, you use yourself as, you know, almost an object and the person who, the main subject that we see interacting in these spaces and, you know, the subject of your photographs as well. And that in itself is a sort of performance. So how much of that, I guess, performance, or how much of it do you see as a performance, and how, you know, what's the importance of you being the person that we see in your work, instead of maybe, you know, using either different subjects, or, you know, what's the meaning behind you being the person in the work?
Yeah, I think, well, for Marked, the two images, it's an actual like reproduction of something from my body. So to use anyone else feels like it, yeah, it's so much about like my body in that case, and like those experiences, and trying to sort of use that as a way to examine other forms of constructs and the way that people exist in the world and their body's relationship to, in this case, land. But I think in the performance pieces, one thing I think a lot about it when I'm on at these sites is, as a person who identifies as a woman, like there is this sort of like discomfort in these spaces. Like I don't feel particularly welcomed in these spaces. When I do these performances, I'm like very much on edge. You know, I'm like, I wear a bodysuit underneath these to sort of, because it's particularly absurd to like be wearing a bikini and then like actually have like no form of my body visible. So it's like a form of like invisibility and hypervisibility, which I sort of relate to ideas around gender as well as whiteness. So, you know, I guess I should back up a little bit. I was reading this book called Invisible Women. And in the book, the author talks a lot about what she calls the default. And the default is essentially the ways in which our entire existence have been constructed through default perspectives, which are typically male and typically white. And so in these spaces, I'm thinking a lot about how my whiteness has a certain way of existing with those who drive onto these sites. Like how am I responded to as a person? And my body starts to like blend into the landscape through the use of the bodysuit against the desert backdrop. However, then I also have, I'm very aware of how my gender identity expresses itself. And that's where that sort of hyper visible clay pigeon bikini, which, you know, the clay pigeon blaze orange color is there to create as much visibility as possible. And it's meant to keep you safe. In fact, when you're hunting. And so there's some interesting sort of contradictions that exist within that color and how it's being used. So I think, I look at marked as having to be me because of the mark on my body and how it's used in the work. And then this newer work, I think it could probably be somebody else. But because I'm thinking about my own role as a white woman and what that means, and how that is viewed and portrayed and the privileges inherent within that, it's important to sort of use myself for that. And also, quite frankly, like, this is really an uncomfortable position to put somebody else in. So it seems only right, if I'm going to do it, that I should probably be the one to do it, just from a purely practical standpoint.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's so interesting to view these videos and, your interactions within the space, and just really take in the person that we're viewing. And, there's so many questions and so many thoughts about what is happening and what are these interventions. And I really love the way that you talked about this. And Josh, I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about your process for this series. As I was reading your statements, it seemed to me that the work is produced in a very, something that it's very organic, I guess. And through that process, that intuition that may come as you're creating them, do you see that as a form of performance as well?
Oh, that's a great question, Nancy. Absolutely. I see them almost as byproducts of a performance, and I'll try to expound on that. A lot of the genesis for these images and a lot of my work comes from what I term like a walking art practice. So I found that one of the best ways for me to come to understand a place is through walking alone and with intent, almost in a, like you were saying, Nancy, in a performative way. I've done a lot of textile work, creating different pieces that I would wear for these performances, but I moved away a bit from trying to document the actual performance and then started thinking about it as kind of the precursor to the visual work that would end up maybe on display somewhere. And in a lot of ways, these individual pieces that make up this desert Rorschach test are the byproduct of these performances in the desert as part of like a walking art practice. And they're all done from memory. There's no reference or any specific photos or anything that I'm looking at when I make them. However, I'm thinking about that movement, that process of like traversing landscape. And so you can see a lot of gestural mark making. And from a formal perspective, I can talk about the materiality of them. It's simply ink, marker, graphite, and pencil on unprimed raw canvas. And so again, I kind of feel that like ties back into some of the textile work I was doing over the last couple years, where, kind of instead of seeing the stretched canvas as the beginning of something, seeing it almost as the end of like kind of that process. And then also I find that working on like unprimed canvas, there's really no place to hide because you can't really erase or gesso over anything. And so there's this like honesty and almost vulnerability to the marks and to the images. And then to kind of tie that back to like the psychological implications, like I think about this idea of vulnerability and what it means to be vulnerable, or to kind of occupy a space where you are letting yourself be vulnerable with other people, and maybe some of the bridges that can be built or the connections that can be made when you're in an environment like that. And again, like not unlike a long walk, I see these as maybe like ever evolving, like when they come back down off the wall of the UMFA, maybe they'll go back in the studio and become reworked again. Who's to say? But I don't like to look at them as a finality. I like to think about them much more as like always in process. just like, you know, new areas that we're looking to explore and hoping to like find ways to like figure out like what is the role of art in like kind of continuing these conversations and bringing some of these ideas to the forefront. And you know, how explicit do you want to be about some of these ideas, and what do you want to like bring forward, and what do you want to like pull back and like maybe leave a bit hidden? And I was thinking a lot about that, Jaclyn, as you were talking, and like kind of like this multi-layered aspects of your work, and like, you know, what are these things we push forward for the viewer and other things we leave like kind of more personal? I think these are like really fun and interesting questions.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things of viewing the work and, you know, reading your statements and then hearing you talk about it is how much there's so many similarities in the way and the things that you explore, but they are done through such different lenses. And it just shows the variety of talent. And it's really exciting to have a show where we are able to see all of that variety of work and concepts, which brings me kind of to my next question. Just to bring us back up to the exhibition, I want to ask you about the faculty show. And you know, you as faculty, you belong to this very unique community of artists, and that community is quite large. You know, there's so many of you, and each of you are working in very specific, unique practices and different ways of art making. And because of that, it's sort of a rare occasion to have all of your work exhibited at the same time under one roof. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of having a show that includes faculty work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting. You know, the last faculty show I was like still in Chicago and dropped off work like the day I arrived and then started teaching. And just to like be included, which I really have to accredit my lovely colleague Ed for including me on that, because I very easily could have been excluded from it. So right away, you know, I felt like the show was a way of feeling like part of the community. And so that I think is really important, because how often do any of us show together, if ever, and the ways in which our works probably don't intersect or do intersect, you know, like it's I feel like those are conversations that we're not often having. Like we're very aware of one another's work, but it's not often that I'm just like seeing everyone's work together. So I'm really excited about it, especially following a year and a half, you know, in quarantine, where I personally have felt, and as has many people, very, you know, sort of isolated, particularly from my art colleagues, just because we're like not on campus. There, you know, there's so many things that have changed. So to have this sort of like momentous occasion where we can, in some ways, celebrate one another is really exciting. So I think it's really great, and it's such a big deal to me, and I'm always excited to participate, and I'm really looking forward to seeing so many of my colleagues' work, or you know, stuff that we've talked about but I haven't ever really seen in person off the internet. So I think that that's really wonderful, and it feels like such a celebration.
Oh, same, Jaclyn. I am so excited to see all the work, and I echo everything that you just said. And I want to say personally, I feel very honored to be part of the show. It wasn't that long ago that I was doing my MFA here at the University of Utah, and so to kind of be part of a show with people that I have called mentors and now call friends, and to kind of build this like really robust and I think remarkable community we have here in the University of Utah Art Department is just such an honor. And like, you know, it just brings like a smile to my face to like, you know, kind of see the slideshow that you put together. It was like a little teaser, Nancy, to see kind of, you know, some of this great work that we'll be able to see here in the next couple of weeks. And, you know, knowing the personalities of all the wonderful people behind the work, I think just enlivens all of that, you know. As we were looking at Brian Sapp's work, I was thinking of, you know, some funny anecdotes, jokes that he told me in the halls, or, you know, looking at Beth's performance piece, I recalled like watching it on Facebook right in the middle of COVID and how important that was for me at the time. And, you know, to kind of see it all collected together under the same roof, I think, you know, it really stands as a testament to like, you know, this group of people really kind of pushing through and, you know, working through like difficult times. But not only that, obviously the UMFA, the institution, like, you know, seeing the importance of showcasing all of the wonderful work that like happens here. And like Jaclyn was saying, kind of like in solitude a lot of times, you know, we kind of know what people are up to, but we don't totally know. So to kind of see some work in real life, I can't wait.
Yeah, you know, it's really exciting, and the majority of the work that will be that is presented in this exhibition was created over the last year that we spent in quarantine and experiencing this pandemic, which for a lot of us was a very different experience. We each had a unique yet, you know, communal experience about this global pandemic. And so to see the work that was produced during that time, one of the things that kept going through my head was, you know, would this work exist had we not been through that experience? And, you know, what other type of work would we be seeing in this moment? And I think it's just really, really touching in some ways to see the response of artists to something so monumental. And at the same time, realizing that for a lot of us, creating was a way to deal with those emotions and deal with so much heaviness that, you know, we were experiencing at that time. So earlier we touched a little bit more about your intent and the themes that you explore and how you want people to approach the work. But as we near the end of our presentation, this is my last question for you. I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about as people view the work included, your work included in this exhibition, what questions do you want them to walk away with?
I'll go first
Josh?
this time, Jaclyn. So great question, Nancy. I think kind of circling back, like you were saying, to the beginning of our discussion, although I've titled the series Desert Rorschach, the individual pieces do have specific names that reference specific places. This is the tapestry wall in Glen Canyon. And I think one of the questions I'm hoping that viewers ask as they look at the work and think about maybe that location or the desert in general is, what human ideas do we impose on our land, on the surrounding non-human landscape that we interact with? What are our like human narratives that we are kind of importing into that space, and what happens when we do that, and how does that change our perspective of our non-human environment? I think these are valid questions that don't have easy answers, but might lead to some other questions relating to our own psyche and how do we interact with other communities of people. You know, I love questions about like about how we gather socially. There's this idea of social sculpture that I'm constantly thinking about that I think is like really important. This notion that collectively we can create sculpture through our through the communities that we're part of. And so again, looking at these Rorschach tests, thinking about not only our human communities, but our more than human communities that we're also a part of. What are we adding to or taking away from those communities? Do those communities even care about us? You know, like, who's to say? But I think one of the great things about visual art is its ability to kind of promote these questions and move the viewer towards an understanding that they may not have come to otherwise, or may have come to differently. You know, I don't want to presume that any of the work that I do would lead someone to some great, you know, idea, but I certainly think that, like, as artists, it is our role to kind of create interventions, to use a word that you used earlier, Nancy, that I think is so key, like to create these interventions wherever they might be, in the West Desert or the Desert Southwest, and kind of lead the viewer towards an alternate understanding of those spaces through a new understanding of themselves.
Yeah, that's hard to follow up. Thanks, Josh. You know, I think with my work, I mean, I guess a lot of artists probably feel this way, you know, like I only hope people are leaving with questions and not answers or solutions. Because I think a lot of the things that I'm addressing, I'm also trying to figure out for myself, my role, how I fit within these spaces. And so I think questions generally are important, but specifically, I think with some of this work is sort of the relationship. You know, I know the land and the body are really obvious tropes, particularly in photography, and the West Desert, or not the West Desert, the American West is also a huge trope within landscape photography. And so using these sort of visuals that I think people can understand in a lot of ways, but presenting them, or trying to present them in a way that sort of expresses their contradictions, or the way in which they push up against one another. You know, thinking about my work from Marked, the way in which like the target residue intersects with like my body or my birthmark, or how these things sort of intersect, and like how we might reconsider how we are responding to certain people's bodies and experiences. But I also think really just like understanding that, like, the clay pigeon is really one example that I you know, felt like was a really great discovery for me, only because it is such a contradiction in how it exists and how I'm using it. And so trying to present those contradictions so that people can, or might attempt to walk away and say, like, what was the goal of this thing that seems to be totally against one another in this methodology? Like, why clean up all this garbage when I couldn't possibly haul all of that away, right? Or where else, you know, or how many times do I have to go to the desert to clean up? And then am I not just like putting myself, you know, being holier than thou by performing this act? So that's not really the goal. The goal is, you know, sort of more like expressing these things and asking people to sort of question, I guess, their own relationship to these objects and these spaces. And the specificity of what those questions are, you know, I couldn't even begin to imagine. But I hope that there are many that people leave with, if not from my work, but from maybe the entirety of how different faculty work sort of intersects and overlaps in the exhibition.
Thank you. Those are great questions. And I think, you know, a lot of times people perceive the act of going in a museum and seeing work as an active experience, or as a passive experience. And I really want the audience to think about it as something where they are creating an experience, and a space to ask questions, to really consider the themes, concepts that are being explored through some really very relevant work. And so I really thank you both for being here tonight and talking to us about these pieces, which I'm really excited for everyone to see in person.
Thanks, Nancy. Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you.
And hi, everybody. I want to additionally share my thanks so much. Nancy, Jaclyn, Josh, what a wonderful presentation and discussion of your work, insights and processes. I'm personally really excited to see them in just a few weeks, as well as all the work of your colleagues. I know a bunch of them are on um, this presentation viewing tonight. And so I just want to say to all of them, thank you so much for contributing to this exhibition. We're all really excited to see it. And I appreciate, especially Nancy, Jaclyn, and Josh, you joining us tonight and taking this time to talk about your art. So thank you. And thank you all art lovers, artists, and special guests for joining us tonight. We hope you had fun and learned a little something as well. Your involvement and your investments are so important to the museum, and we honestly couldn't do what we do without you, so thank you. I hope you will all join us at our members only day on Friday, August 20th. You'll get to see the exhibition prior to the general public. And of course, as always, we'll have special treats and opportunity drawing. And I hope all of our artists will be present at some point throughout the day to interact with our members and all of you, and any questions or conversation that you might like to have about art and the exhibition. So please plan on reserving a spot for that via our website. And until then, have a wonderful evening, and thank you again for all that you do. Thank you again, Nancy, Jaclyn, and Josh. Good night, everyone.